Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Few subjects in our public discourse are as contradictory as government transparency. Every politician talks about it. Elections are sometimes won or lost on the subject. Yet in reality, it's a very different story. Perhaps it's hard to conduct modern business under the glare of the public spotlight, particularly in this age of the internet and always-on 24/7 news. Perhaps it's one of the challenges that our founders might never have grasped. But how do we balance the public's need to know with the government's ability to do its work, sometimes out of the harsh spotlight? Over the years, methods and institutions like the 1966 Freedom of Information Act have come along to try and do this. But for every effort like this, those in the inner recesses of government and in the administrative state have found ways to circumvent the process. As we have seen in modern times, from the JFK assassination records to the January 6th documents, the goal of government always seems to be to wear down those making requests for information and make them give up and cry uncle. After all, often those people protecting government secrets are there forever, and those seeking the information sometimes have a life. That's the struggle that award-winning author Nicholson Baker highlights as he seeks to find out more about America's possible use of biological weapons during the Korean War. But the broader issues that he illustrates are timeless, even with the perspective and protection of 3/4 of a century. And like the assassination 60 years ago, facts are hard to come by. Nicholson Baker is the author of 16 books, including Baseless, My Search for Secrets in the Ruins of the Freedom of Information Act. His work has appeared in numerous publications, and he's received the National Book Critics Circle Award. He founded the American Newspaper Repository in order to save large collections of U.S. newspapers. And it is my pleasure to welcome Nicholson Baker to the Who, What, Why podcast. Nick, thanks so much for being here.
Wow, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you in spirit, Jeff, and to talk about information.
Well, it's good to have you here. First of all, what set you on this search? Why did you want to find out this information about the Korean War?
Well, I didn't know much about the Korean War. I did not know much about biological weapons. I'm not intrinsically interested in them, except that my grandfather was a pathologist and he used to talk about fungal diseases at the dinner table. And one of the first things that happened was, when I was researching a whole different book that was about microfilming valuable library holdings and tossing out the original documents, I saw a book in the library, in a university library, and it was about the Korean War and the question of whether biological weapons were used. And I looked down the list, and one of my grandfather's diseases was on the list, this disease, coccidioidomycosis. And I thought, wow, that's just bizarre that American scientists were willing to work on and intensify diseases, and we're really trying to make people sick more efficiently for this long period. And it pulled at me. It horrified me, of course. I mean, it's a bad idea, but also it was also the question, sort of the question mark over the whole thing. Who done it? Is it in fact true what the Chinese said and what the North Koreans said? Is it true that some unit of American forces tried to make an enemy sick during a war? Is that true? Bizarrely enough, it's still a question.
And how did you begin to dig in?
Well, I began by reading books and then the documents that are behind the books. I went to the National Archives. I went to the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the Truman Library, to repositories in various universities, private papers. There's a lot. There's a lot that you can learn about the past. But there's a class of documents that's particularly interesting, and why they're interesting is that you're not allowed to learn what's on them. And so I would be sitting in the National Archives reading room in College Park. It's a beautiful, big, light-filled room, and there are, maybe 300 people sitting at little desks, and we're all going through our papers for following some research path, and it's fascinating, and it's a great privilege to sit there and be able to look at the record of one's own government. Every so often, though, as I was turning the pages of the records of this very small Air Force department in the Pentagon, I would come to a piece of cardstock, yellow, stiff cardboard, and it would say access restricted. The document was removed on such and such a date, and it would be the initials of the person who removed it, and maybe the person who sent the memo and received it, and it would be a memo from, say, 1950. And I'm thinking, why, when all these other memos have been declassified, all of them are stamped top secret. So every single memo in this entire file is top secret, and yet these ones are still being kept secret. That's the crucial information that this piece of cardboard can tell me that. The next step is to say, what is the document? So then you file a request for that thing. And I did that in 2012. I said, here's 21 documents I know exist, and they're just across the wall. They're behind. They're in a secure area. And I still haven't been able to see them. 8 years have gone by, many emails, nothing. It's not an untypical experience, actually, for a person who's trying to do research.
Right.
It's the norm, really, if you're writing about sensitive things.
One of the things about the Freedom of Information Act that is so frustrating that you talk about is that while it exists and seems like a good idea on the surface, there's absolutely no enforcement mechanism for it.
Well, that's true. It's, for a while, the fact that it was a law forced out, was a kind of a useful crowbar and a lot of really amazing sets of documents, thousands, millions of pages of documents, especially during, the law was signed in 1965, so all the way through 1975, 76, all the way through the Reagan administration, some really amazing, lurid, shocking episodes from the past, from Democratic administrations and from Republican administrations, came into public view as a result of it. Then there began to be these kind of, this defanging process, or this process of taking away certain powers of the Freedom of Information Act so that fewer and fewer documents came under its jurisdiction. And that has been, there have been ups and downs with that. But we're now at a point where the law is simply scoffed at. It's not enforced. I mean, the law is that you're supposed to get a response from a government agency for some document that you're requesting within 20 days. But some people wait 20 years. So it's not, and there's no consequence to the government agency. It doesn't happen. The only way you get something sometimes is if you sue. And if you're, it costs money, it takes time, it makes you crazy. So people don't sue. So what happens is that because the law is unenforced, history suffers. We don't know what our country actually did at crucial points in its history as a result of the fact that this law is sitting on the books but isn't being executed in practice.
And so much of the intent is to, it seems, to wear down those making the request, that's not a bug, that's a feature at this point.
I felt it, and that's why I wrote this book as a diary, is because I think it's useful to point out the cost or the feeling that you get when you have to wait for years for something to be released. What does it do to you? It's demoralizing, and it's crazy making, really. But also the kinds of responses you get, these polite letters from, let's say, the CIA saying, we made a thorough search, and then they come up with some reason they can't release something, and then you send a letter back called an appeal, and you say, yes, but that's not actually true because of these reasons. Another year goes by. It's an amazing ballet of frustration. I mean, it's just so hard because all you want is to know what happened. And you've got a document. Sometimes you've got a document. You know what they look like. They're blacked out or white. You've got a document that has words on it, but then all the useful, interesting, the action words, the words that would actually tell you what's going on in people's minds or what events had just happened in this memo, let's say, are blacked out. And you know that something is there. And it'll say something like, Mr. Wissner reported on the trip to blank. And he said that they were encountering blank and that many other operations would happen in the adjoining country of blank. So you know that things are being talked about, but all of the crucial nuggets that would make you able to understand what is actually going on, are all withheld. So that document counts as a declassified document, even though it has absolutely nothing to tell you. And that does wear on the person who is trying to get at what happened.
The other catch-22 of all of this sometimes is that the requests are rejected because there isn't enough information, but it's impossible to get the information to make the request without seeing the document.
Well, that's a very good point. The one thing that I think is crucially important to do is to take the records of some of these big agencies, chief among them the CIA itself, out from under the CIA. Take the records from the CIA in the 1950s and 1960s away from the CIA so that they are not protecting them in order to preserve their own, in order to survive currently. What we need to know is how much is there. And even if they don't declassify everything, if you know that there are, let's say, 50 boxes about a certain revolution in a certain country, let's say, 50 boxes of documents survive. Miracle. You know that then if they send you 12 pieces of paper, that's a very small release. But if you don't know the total size of the records that the agency is controlling, you never know sort of where you are. And this is the chronic state of historical research, is that you don't know how much. So the agency will say, we made a search of our records and we have these 3 pages for you. And you think, well, is that 3 pages out of 3,000 or 30 or, how much have you got? They're not going to tell you. So you never know what is the iceberg and what is the tip.
You've alluded to this a couple of times, that the kind of psychological effect that it has, the way it wears you down. It's,
what is it? It comes and goes, and that's why I wrote it as a diary. Sometimes it's interesting to have a kind of charged emptiness and a feeling that there's something there, it's there, and you can't get at it, so you think, I'm going to outsmart it. I'm going to look at newspaper articles from that period. I'm going to look at private document collections in universities. I'm going to figure out what that was, even though the agency is not releasing that. And it's sort of this challenge that's kind of exciting. But, it's only exciting for a while. And after a while, you really just, it's what you said so beautifully in your introduction. It's a game of waiting. And an agency has people who are paid a lot of money to go very slowly with things. The classic example of that, actually, there's this beautiful story. I mean, this book is about sad things, but it's also about inspiring things. And this little group called Muck Rock brought a suit against the CIA saying, you have this huge digital trove of declassified documents, and people can only see them in a certain room in the National Archives, 4 computer terminals that are surveilled by many cameras, and your keystrokes are recorded. Those documents are declassified, so we're bringing suit, and we're suing you to say that these documents should be made freely available to anyone who wants them. And the CIA said, oh, no, that would take us 28 years to do that. We'd have to look at every document to make sure that it was fully declassified before we released it. And then that seemed ridiculous, and everybody kind of scoffed and said, 28 years? I mean, come on. And then they came back and said, no, we've recalculated. It would only take us 6 years. And then this guy, Jeff Scudder, who had worked at the CIA and knew about digital stuff, became part of the lawsuit. And he said, go to Staples, cost you $69 to get an external drive, take you 2 days to download those documents, and it would be a matter of trivial expertise. This is something you could do instantly. And as soon as he said that, the lawsuit changed, and the CIA, this multi-billion-dollar, massively secretive organization, folded. And it put all these documents that had only been accessible from these 4 computer terminals, it put them on its own website. It said, we are making things available because we are, open transparency advocates and we're doing a great thing. Well, they were forced to do it. Whatever, it doesn't matter. These documents are now available to anybody who wants to look at them anywhere in the world. And they're a record of some really bizarre thing. And so that was a huge victory that happened that actually helped me a lot in writing the book, because some of the documents were material to the period I was studying.
There's also the sense that when they give you one piece of paper or a couple of pieces of paper, that you're so grateful for that you forget about the larger tranche that you haven't gotten.
It's funny. There's that, and the CIA has this weird way of sealing envelopes. They believe that if you send something through the U.S. mail, it has to be not just, you don't just lick the envelope and seal it. You have to take one of those big sort of industrial brown sealing tape, and they actually seal the back of the envelope with this brown string reinforced tape. So you've got a letter. It looks like a regular letter on the front, and it says my address, and then it says return address CIA. Turn the back, and there it is. It's sort of like a lock on a safe. Is this piece of brown paper, and even so, it's exciting. You think, well, maybe there's something, material in here, and then you open it up, and so often, almost always, it's a response that's a non-response. It's saying we haven't found anything, or we're denying your request, or and it's just wrong. Basically, it's just wrong, because we're talking about American history. And in order to do American history, you actually have to have access to what people wrote in the State Department, in the CIA, in the White House. You have to know what was the Truman administration doing? What were the Eisenhower administration doing? Those things are held back from us now. But we can't learn from some of the patterns and mistakes and behaviors and things that were said and done in the past properly, because we don't know what they were. So we can't actually be informed citizens in looking at our current predicament and learn from what we've been through. We're in a state of enforced amnesia.
The other aspect is that, and this becomes a joke sometimes, but maybe this is at the core of it, the idea that government repeats the same mistakes over and over again, that we do the same things wrong. Part of the reason may be that we don't have access to that history of how these mistakes were made.
Very true. I think that's absolutely true. You can see in the case of our adventures in regime change that things that happened in Albania or in Guatemala or in Africa somewhere, or in Cuba, kept the bones, the structure of an intervention was often very similar. And in fact, in the CIA, in the clandestine service is what it's called, I guess, a department that was begun by the Truman administration in 1948 under a man named Frank Wisner. The record of those operations in let's say Iran or Guatemala were held in binders, and they were sort of used as pattern books for the next subversion or intervention. So one of the reasons these historical events seem similar is because the people who were engaged in the covert action were referring to the notebooks from the past. So we would need to know everything that are in those notebooks. And what we got is some, especially in Guatemala, we have some of what's there and not all of what's there. And that's wrong.
To what extent did you find that the government plays favorites, that there might be journalists or organizations that they're willing to release some material to and others not? And certainly they have ways of accomplishing that.
Well, that does happen. I think that if you are thought to be friendly to an agency, it's more likely that they will make some things available to you. And that's understandable. I mean, I see that if you let's say you're writing about the Navy. If you're a great fan of naval history and you feel that you're going to write a kind of inspiring story about something in World War II, you're going to get treated differently than if you're looking into some unfortunate event that happened under the jurisdiction of the Navy. Let's say the Navy's work in plague research in Alameda, on the island of Alameda, the Naval Research Program. Well, they're going to resist that. The Navy is exceedingly secretive about that. I understand that. I mean, it's just the reality of it. I guess the point of this is partly to just bang the gong and say, look, live with me through the difficulty of trying to arrive at a coherent account of what happened a long time ago, and you will understand why it is important to reform the process by which old secrets are revealed. It's important, it's material, it affects our behaviors as a citizenry right now. We would vote differently and think differently if we knew better where we came from.
Certainly part of it is the kind of gotcha atmosphere that we live in politically, because every side, every politician, every person inside government is so afraid that they might want to reveal somebody else's secrets, but someday it could happen to them. And instead of learning from these mistakes and using them in a positive light, everything becomes a game of gotcha.
And the politicization of everything is so exhausting, isn't it? I mean, and really, if you look back, the structure of the American presidency, it's fairly consistent. It doesn't matter what a president says about the desire for openness and everything. Each president, when they get into power, ends up sort of seduced or something by this fact that he's sitting on a mountain of weapons and armies and secret armies, and so every president ends up doing things all over the world that he should not be doing. That is consistent. It's Democratic and it's Republican. It doesn't have anything to do with your where you stand. It's just it's this, unfortunately, and that's the basic thing, is we've got to understand this is nonpartisan.
Beyond the political aspect, the other part of this, and it's true of presidents, it's true of even, lower level people in cabinets, there's a certain seduction to secrecy. Talk about that.
I think it's part of how the CIA, for instance, markets itself. The CIA's product is secrets, and the excitement of its being a shadowy realm of unknowability gives it a certain kind of an allure. And the idea of saying it's the Central Intelligence Agency, and the intelligence that it has is so intelligent that normal mortals can't know it, is part of how it markets itself, And in fact, it's just a bunch of people sitting at desks figuring out how to poke and prod other governments to do things that Americans want done. That's not going to sound good. So secrecy is part of the creation of a kind of excitement, a feeling of a club to which you either do belong or don't belong. If you have a security clearance in Washington, you are somebody. You breathe a different atmosphere. You are a person who has access to unknowable things that other people don't even know can be known. This is exciting. So yes, there's absolutely part of it is the fact that secrecy itself is a kind of exciting, intoxicational solvent that flows around documents.
Nicholson Baker. Nick, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
That was a pleasure. Thanks for the questions. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.